First of all, the year 1919 is a critical year in world history. You know, of course, that the war ended in November, the Great War ended in November of 1918. In 1919, they gathered to make the peace. So today I'm going to be talking essentially about the Treaty of Versailles and what the prospects for world peace were at that time, why the treaty ultimately was a failure, and why it led directly to the Second War. The First War explains the Second, because the problems that arise in 1919 at the peace conference are problems which will, within 20 years, trigger the Second War. And one historian mentions that the Second War, in a sense, really didn't end until 1994, when the last Russian soldier left German territory. So in essence, and so today I'm mostly going to talk about the Treaty of Versailles and why 1919 was proved to be such a critical year. But in subsequent lectures, next week I'm going to talk about America in 1919, the end of the war, and the critical events of 1919 in the United States. There was, for example, the Women's Suffrage Amendment. You're going to hear a lot about that. It was passed by the Congress. Wasn't ratified until the following year, but it concerned the woman's right to vote. It's interesting also that a woman's delegation from England appeared, suffragettes. They appeared at Versailles, and it was decided, sort of pat them on the head, but the treaty wouldn't take up anything like that. The chief objectors, incidentally, were the Japanese. Interesting. Also in the United States, the black migration northward collided with the return of troops from Europe. And what you had were riots in all the major cities. Lynchings became a common part of Southern history at this time. Large numbers of lynchings, many of them like public spectacles. And then the response of black leaders in 1919. Finally, you had also anti-immigrant. The Great Red Scare began in 1919. The fear that the Bolsheviks were spreading, and they were spreading within Europe. There was fear, but on the other hand, many innocent immigrants were deported, swept up into this great fear. The result was a new immigration law, which began restricting immigrants from part of Europe. I'm going to talk about that next week. And what you have, this enormous fear of immigration, especially immigration from Eastern and Southeastern Europe. So it was aimed at specific people who were deemed less than desirable. And it lasted until, I think, 1964. It was responsible for restricting the number of Jews who could come to this country during the period of the late 30s and 40s. That immigration law was not changed until the 1960s. So that's very critical. That's going to be next week. The third week, when the war ended in 1919, Europe controlled 85% of the world's surface. So what you had was, in a sense, the expansion of the British, the French. The great empires had collapsed during World War I. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian, the Tsarist Empire, the German Empire, Austria-Hungary. All of these great empires, which had endured for centuries, suddenly collapsed. Now what to do? with the how to rearrange the map. The principle that they used, Wilson called it self-determination of peoples. Poles should live in Poland, and the new Poland that was created, and Italians in parts that had been Austria-Hungary, and Slavs in their own great state, Yugoslavia, and so use the principle of nationality. That was the theory. But what about those caught in the wrong country? There were, for example, Germans caught in Poland. What happens to them? Well, they lost the war, get them back to Germany. That was kind of the feeling. You know, one of the causes, one of the episodes that led to World War II, were the episode of the Sudeten Germans. They were people of German nationality who had, were part of Czechoslovakia when they drew the map. And that was, of course, Hitler's excuse for dismantling the new state of Czechoslovakia, which had emerged after World War I. But more than that, you had European expansion into the rest of the world. So the Middle East, for example, that was part of the treaty with Turkey. The Sultanate, the Ottoman Empire, had collapsed. Now what to do? The British and the French made an agreement in 1916. They weren't going to hand it over to perhaps an enemy power. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. You were going to get, the French expressed an interest in Syria, in Lebanon. The British expressed an interest in Palestine. That's a whole other story. They expressed an interest also in what was not a country, but three provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. They were the three provinces, became Mesopotamia, became Iraq. Well, this is for you and this is for me. Sykes-Picot Agreement, it was called, that was 1916. So there were, and then in addition to all of these problems, there was also the problem of India for England. I'll take that up on the third lecture. More Indians died in combat, were drafted into British or enlisted in the British Army. There were more Indians who died on the Western Front, for example, than Australians or New Zealanders. But they had done it for a reason. We will be a dominion like the white dominions. The British had more or less promised that. But when the war ended, oh no, that will take time. They instituted bills that would restrict meetings and demonstrations. A massacre occurs. Demonstrators are shot by the British Army on the spot. Huge demonstrations. Gandhi, he now emerges for the first time as a player in India. And even more than, you know, they have asked, it's the 100th anniversary of the Great Massacre in India, the Amritsar Massacre. And the Indian government has formally asked Queen Elizabeth to issue an apology. That happened a few weeks ago, and now I learn from today's New York Times, or yesterday's, that the Chinese are also asking for recognition. There was a rebellion in China against, did you know that China was a participant in World War I?
No.
Most people don't. Why did they join the war? Well, to protect themselves from the Japanese. The Chinese government, which was in pretty much flux at that time, the Japanese were a British ally, had signed a treaty in 1902. When war broke out, the Japanese announced, we were going to be true to our treaty obligations, we will enter the war. The British reply was, you don't have to bother. No, we're going to enter the war. So in fact, they did. What did they hope to gain? All the German possessions in Asia, leaseholds, and so on. Well, the Chinese were hoping that this was the beginning of a new era, the exploitation of China era. And so when it turned out in the treaty that Japan inherited all of the German leaseholds in China, there were demonstrations, student demonstrations, University of Peking, in Tiananmen Square. It was called the May 4th movement. It was one of the most significant movements in modern Chinese history. It lit the fuse. Within a year, the Communist Party had been founded. The moribund Kuomintang, originally founded by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, that had been revived. It was the beginning. Someone had to stand up for China, the students said. Well, this is a direct. They had their hopes raised, a new world order. But at the very moment, there were demonstrations in Palestine, as you know, because in the treaty that was signed the following year, they confirmed the British confirmed the Balfour Declaration. So that didn't meet with any degree of hope. And then finally, there was a war in Morocco, Spanish Morocco, there was a demonstrations in other words, Europe controlled 85% of the world's surface in 1919. Within the next decades, that world was on fire. And by the end of World War II, whole new nations had come into being. So this is really, in 1919, the sparks of Chinese nationalism, Indian nationalism, Arab nationalism, so we're all lit. So we'll look at that, the third, and then the last week, I don't know if you were aware of this, because I myself was not. A book came out a few years ago called The Vanquished. The historian who wrote it explored whole new areas that really had never been fully explored before. The Treaty of Versailles ended the war in Europe. Did you know that there were 7 wars that continued? Small wars that continued from 1919 until 1923. There was a civil war in Finland. There was a Polish civil war and then a war against communist Russians. There was within Galicia, parts of the Ukraine, a red-white war. In other words, there was a war within Hungary. Romanians who had been trapped in Hungary revolted against the Hungarians. 7 wars. The most important, I guess, was the Greek war against Turkey. The Turks were losing their empire. They were on the losing side. And the Greeks decided to attack. And the Turks fought back very successfully. It went on until 1923. It ended with the mass evacuation of every Greek from Anatolia, and the evacuation of every Turk from every part of Europe. It's estimated that 3 million people died in these wars. The most vicious was the Red-White War in Russia, the communists versus the White Russian forces, mostly commandeered by generals, czarist generals. But it all went on until 1923, and it led to maybe 3 million lives. It's interesting, too, that if you were trapped in the wrong country, you could always leave and go to the country of birth. For example, there were many Germans who were trapped in what became Poland. They were thrown out. They didn't stay to become a dissident minority. They were expelled, lock, stock, and barrel. So there was a great deal of movement, and this movement was accompanied by tremendous suffering and fighting, war, mini wars, and so on. It was nice if you had a place to go. The one exception in Eastern Europe were the Jews. It's estimated that about 200,000 Jews were murdered in this part of Europe in these small wars that went on between 1918 and 1923. But of all the minorities that you got caught in the wrong country, a German got caught in what became Poland, he could go back to Germany. The Jews had nowhere to go. And so that I'm going to deal with in the 4th lecture. All right, any question before I begin? This was all introductory. So let me just say that they call the, that's why 1919 is so critical, a year. In 1919, you can see every trend that is coming in the rest of the century. You see you can see the Second War really, in a sense, coming up. When they came to the peace conference and were given the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the German representative, Erzberger, by this time Germany had become a republic. Overnight, the Kaiser had fallen and Republican elements had taken over, and they thought they would be dealt with gently because they were now a republic. And when they got the peace terms, they were shocked. And Erzberger's comment was, how can they give us terms like this? After all, did Germany lose the war? Well, yes, but since they were winning until, I guess, the summer of 1918, they found it very hard to believe that they had lost the war. How could this be? So let me see if I can, in a sense, give you some idea of, the 20th century really began, I guess, in 1919. It was the first year of the 20th century, not 1900. You call historic centuries don't really obey numerical limits. So it wasn't actually the year 1900 that began the century. The century actually began in 1918 with the end of the war. We have brackets. 1815, the Napoleonic Wars ended. And a peace conference was held. You probably remember it from college, the Congress of Vienna. The personnel, the Tsar of Russia, the King of France, the Emperor of Austria, the Emperor of Prussia, King of Prussia, they were the ones who made the peace, and their delegates. The aristocracy, royalty. They were responsible for making a peace. They didn't have to consult anybody. They didn't have to subject their decisions to referenda. They were in charge. They made the peace. Now, there were many small wars during the 19th century. It was a 7 Weeks' War. There were 3 German wars, one against Denmark, one against France, one against Austria in the middle of the century. But none of them lasted for a long time. They were short wars for definite objectives. Nothing like the Napoleonic Wars, which had, erupted after the French Revolution and lasted until 1815. So they made a peace. It was a peace of the kings, the emperors, but it held. Aside from regional wars, it held until 1914. That's why everyone was taken by such surprise in 1914. No one had a memory of a war. No one understood that in the century before, Europe had industrialized. What does it mean when you industrialize? What does that have to do with warfare? Well, it means one man with a Maxim gun, that's a repeating machine gun, can mow down a troop on horseback. The war is different. It's a mechanized war. It's a different kind of war. They had no idea of that. The frontal assault, the charge of the Light Brigade. Churchill was a part of the last British, the charge of the cavalry in Africa in the war, the Sudan War, the Battle of Omdurman. It was the end of the cavalry, the end of the, as I say, the unmechanized war. Had no idea what that would mean to warfare. And so when the war began, when it came, I can't go into all the background of the war, you probably know it. The Archduke was assassinated, you know that, by a Serbian nationalist. There was great resentment that Austria-Hungary, a German kingdom, was asserting itself in the Balkan Peninsula and was denying Serbia an outlet to the sea. So this accidental event, one historian wrote, how is it possible that how would it approach reality that a Maori soldier from New Zealand was a casualty of the Battle of Gallipoli, buried in Turkey because a Serbian shot an Austrian? How could that be? But they didn't see it that way at the beginning of the war. And it's interesting, it was the most beautiful summer in Europe in memory. People were flocking to the seashore because the quality of life had improved along with industrialization. People, even in England, even the working class could afford a week at the seashore. Things were getting better, not worse. And so, this is what one writer said. The biggest question in modern history, why the war? Europe and the United States sailed upon a summer sea. This is one prominent where I had rarely experienced a summer more luxuriant, more beautiful, a golden age. And then the commentary, like airline passengers on United Airline 826, Europe and America in the glorious last days of June 1914 cruised ahead above a summer sea and beneath a cloudless sky until they were hit by a bolt that they wrongly believed came from out of the blue. Suddenly, within the month of June, the reactions to the war, and I can't go into, some of you took my other class of World War I, so I won't go into it again. But anyhow, the reactions were positive. Nobody said, "Oh my God, we can't possibly," except some of the British. I'll get to that in a minute. Let me read you some of the reactions. Youth was bored. It was too much peace. It was boring. Listen to some of this. A marvelous surprise. These are a German writer. This holy moment. Rupert Brooke, the great British writer. A fine thrill like nothing else in the world. A privilege. He is dead who will not fight. We will be back before the leaves fall off the trees. This is Thomas Mann, no less. An opportunity to transcend myself, to cleanse one's soul and escape the materialism and intellectual vermin of a horrible world of peace. Thomas Mann, the Magic Mountain, no less. The harbinger of a mystic synthesis of might and spirit, a Third Reich. This is the chief rabbi of Berlin, Leo Beck. You probably know his name. This war is a useful evil. It allows us to sense how the life of the fatherland is ours and how its conscience resonates in our own. Leo Beck. Max Weber, one of the great intellectuals of Germany. Regardless of eventual success, this war is great and wunderbar. Now I'll read you another reaction that you'll probably. To me, those hours seemed like a release from the painful feelings of my youth. Even today, I am not ashamed to say that overpowered by strong enthusiasm, I fell down on my knees and thanked heaven. Who do you think that was? Church. Adolf Hitler. He had gone to Munich. He was living in Munich and he enlisted. And there is actually a picture, a photograph that exists, where you see that the war has been proclaimed. There's this great public square, and they have isolated the picture of Hitler in that square, thanking God. He's been released from the boredom of a bourgeois existence. We'll be back before the leaves fall off the trees. They went to their slaughter happily, extraordinary. And they were happy. Now, not everyone. There were others who understood that something terrible was imminent. Disraeli, 1860. The age of nationalities will not be of short duration or of a very tranquil character. That was in 1860. André Gide, the great writer, we are getting ready to enter a long tunnel full of blood and darkness. Winston Churchill, the wars of peoples will be more terrible than those of kings. Well, the inventor of the Maxim gun, Hiram Maxim, if you want to make your fortune, invent something which will allow those fool Europeans to kill each other more quickly. It's an American who invented it. Well, this was the war, the first war in which the technology of the industrial era was applied to the slaughter of human beings. They still thought one big battle. This was the first great battle will decide the whole war, and wars will be short. The idea of offense must penetrate the spirit of our nation. That was actually a Japanese general. Well, the population had grown exponentially through the 19th century, so it meant that overnight millions were under arms. They all had conscription, and the millions were under arms. The only country that did not have conscription was England. And it's interesting, the sequence of war, of the declarations, you know that Austria sent the famous ultimatum 4 weeks after the assassination. And I might add that the prince who was killed was not terribly popular among his fellow Austrians, but that's another story. They sent it 4 weeks later. They thought about it. They understood that potentially there were implications here that they might not foresee. It took about a month, and they framed it. The Austrian General Staff decided that if Serbia could get away with this, then all the nationalities that comprised Austria-Hungary might get their own ideas. So the ultimatum was sent. But Serbia had a big brother, Russia. What would Russia do? The Russians declined to reply, but they immediately ordered mobilization. Mobilization was an act of war. If your opponent mobilized, he got ahead of you, and that could be fatal. So the Russians now began mobilization. The Germans took that as an act of war. Russia was allied with France. They then sent a note to the French, what do you propose to do? The French replied, we will follow our own interests. The Germans now declare war on France. The French have an agreement with the British. The British really mull it over what to do. Should they, in a sense, come to the assistance of France? It's some sort of an optional thing. So they think long and hard about it, and they're very reluctant. More than any other country in Europe, they foresee what well might happen. The famous Lord Grey was the foreign minister at the time. This famous statement, he looked out of the window at St. James Park. The lamplighters were lighting the gas lamps. And he said, the lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. So they understood what this step meant. The Times of London on the 3rd of August. Europe is to be the scene of the most terrible war that she has witnessed since the fall of the Roman Empire. The blame must fall mainly upon Germany. She could have stayed the plague had she chosen to speak in Vienna, as she speaks when she is in earnest. She has not chosen to do so. And we know, most historians, you know, they've weighed the whole question of war guilt, who is most responsible. The verdict is mainly the German responsibility. They were a great power, and they acted irresponsibly by really coaching Austria. Austria, they could see, was a dying power. You must stand up. That was the feeling in Germany. And as far as Russia was concerned, they were afraid of Russia. All of the General Staff memos show that they were terrified of Russian modernization. It had begun after 1905, and they were convinced that Russia was the rising power in Europe, and they had to cut it off, right? You look at the memoirs of the German General Staff, you'll see note after note that suggests this explanation. But the whole process began, and it was almost like an automatic movement, one after the other after the other. The Economist, this was August, the greatest tragedy of human history. Since last week, millions of men have been drawn from the field and the factory to slay one another by order of the warlords of Europe. It is perhaps the greatest tragedy of human history. No question about it. Now, even within on the German side, many of them were very reluctant. One sec. The diary of Bethmann Hollweg, who was the German premier, the Chancellor expects that the war, whatever its outcome, will result in the uprooting of everything that exists. The existing world, very antiquated, without ideas. Moltke, the famous general, he was the son of the great Moltke. The culture of almost all of Europe will be destroyed for decades to come. And the Chancellor himself, I see a doom greater than human power hanging over Europe and our own people. These were some of the feelings on the eve. You know, after the war was over, they came to Bethmann Hollweg, he was still alive, and they said to him, how did this happen? 9 million dead. Another 6 or 7 million maimed for life. The circles of grief. Each of these 9 million had a mother and a father and aunts and uncles and cousins and friends. The circles of grief. Many lived maimed for the rest of their lives. Terrible facial injuries. Remember the Phantom of the Opera with no face? That was a common injury. They had a factory that did nothing but manufacture masks for faces. So they asked Bethmann Hollweg, how did this happen? And his answer was, if only one knew. A classic answer? All right, so now the deaths, the totals. Germany lost 1 million, 900,000 wounded. France, 1,700,000. Austria-Hungary, 1,500,000. These are dead and wounded. Italy, 460,000. Russia, 1,700,000. The U.S., 140,000, because we came in so late. Turkey, 600,000. Between 1870 and 1899, there were 16 million male births. 13% died. Germany and France, between 1892 and 1895, of the male births, 37.5% died. Wounded, 500,000, and 500,000 maimed for life. The numbers, the casualties were they were unbelievable, because no one understood that when industrialization was applied to warfare, then you were going to get casualties like they had not adjusted their thinking, they did not understand that, and thus the terrible totals of the war. And then the peace treaty and the attempt to settle all of these issues, probably doomed for, how could you settle? This was going to be a world of peace, because in 1917, as you know, the war had really hit a kind of a stasis. The great battles of 1916, what were they? Well, there was the Somme, the Battle of the Somme. Between 9 in the morning and noon, the British lost 20,000 dead. A frontal assault on the German lines, which they thought had been decimated by bombing, but guess what? The Germans were alive in their lines. The Battle of Verdun, no strategic importance, 350,000 deaths on each side. No one had ever known a war like this. The use of poison gas, for example. And when it ended, the results were not particularly conclusive. So what you had really was not only the most, expensive war in history, but it ended almost, with no real decision. The United States came into the war in 1917. We had stayed studiously out of the war. What brought the U.S. in? The Germans in 1917 decided to declare a naval blockade. No ships in the war zone. The United States was carrying on a very profitable trade with England. We were the source of most of their supplies. It meant that trade would end. Secondly, in addition to that, it was a violation of the law of the sea. It was an international violation of law. Thirdly, there's something going on underneath all of this too. I think I recommended to you a new book by Graham Allison that was published, maybe a year ago. And what he suggests in the book is that there's always in the world a rising nation and a ruling nation. That tends to be the form of world history. Ruling nation, a rising nation. In 1914, the British were the ruling nation. Once they had acquired India, their empire stretched around the world. They were first in industrial output, first in naval preeminence. You could conceive of them as the ruling nation. Not that they, imposed themselves, but nevertheless, the sun never set on the British Empire. Germany was the rising nation. And you can see that in the commentary. Why should the British be the ruling nation? Germany was the rising nation in terms of industrial output, art strength, position in Europe, and so on. And so, in a sense, it was a challenge that it led to war. And in many ways, it led to the Second War as well. Because we know now, why did Hitler rise to power, really, in a sense, pledging to reverse the verdict of the First War. Germany now is the great power, the rising power. And it's Germany that, as Bismarck used to put it, needs her place in the sun. This is the inevitable pattern of world history, that a rising power and a ruling power will inevitably clash, except on very rare occasions. All right, so the results in 1918 really weren't conclusive. The U.S. had entered the war. The Germans took that chance that the U.S. would enter the war when they declared the blockade. But they didn't think much of the United States. Our, I think, Army was rated 17th in the world. What they did not glimpse was that economically, the United States, by the late 19th century, had become the most powerful economy, thus the most powerful country in the world, and hadn't glimpsed that. We had trouble, for example, quelling a problem with Mexico, how to send troops in. They had no idea what the economic. By 1916, the U.S. output surpassed any in the history of the world. So they didn't know that from being 17th in Army listings, you could become #1 in a very short time. And so, of course, we hadn't gone to war when the Lusitania was sunk, but now, and underneath it all, the fear in 1918, or 17, that Britain was going down, and we could not permit that. It's interesting, 1917 was the year of the Russian Revolution. It was the year when Russia left the war and made peace with the Germans, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. If you want to look at a difficult treaty, Versailles had this punitive peace. No, look at Brest-Litovsk. The Russians lost all of European Russia. They lost their naval bases. They lost economic progress because they had to supply the German army. It was the most punitive peace, as Lenin put it, it is a rotten peace, but we must have peace. They had to consolidate their powers. And so that was 1917. They could withdraw, the Germans could withdraw all their forces from Russia and throw it against the French for a final knockout blow. Ludendorff planned it. It would be a final knockout blow against France. That would be the end of it. The war, they would then dictate the peace treaty. And that was the prognosis for 1918. No understanding that the United States, in effect, was an economic behemoth and would be able to replace all the losses that the Allies had suffered. So they planned the final campaign. It was called Operation Michael, and it began in early 1918. It was a last push. They transferred most of their troops to Western Europe, and they began this massive push forward. Ludendorff was the general. Well, what happened? Huge success in the first few months, and then American supplies began to arrive, and American troops began to arise. And so the French were really at the point of collapse. 1917, Verdun. How could you justify a war like Verdun, a battle like Verdun? It was the only point of the battle was to bleed the other side white. It's interesting that in World War II, the Germans came through Verdun in 3 hours. The French could not fight again as they had fought at Verdun. No one could fight that way. So the battles of 1917, 16 and 17, completely, all those young men who skipped off to war so happy, a release from boredom. This is wonderful. Would be so happy to lie, on the ground, having given up my life for my country. Incidentally, let me make one point also. The poetry that came out of this war is extraordinary. Never been anything like it, really. It's just an extraordinary kind, and you can tell a lot about the progress of the war by looking at the poetry. Right? I've got, I think I Xeroxed. I'll give it to you in a minute, okay. Rupert Brooke, he's a great British poet. God be thanked who has matched, this is 1914, who has matched us with this hour and caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping. Wonderful. Then the famous poem, 1915, by a Canadian poet. In Flanders field, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders field. Now the last stanza is interesting. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from falling hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. In other words, we're dead, but here's the torch. Keep on going. Don't stop. Don't fail. Okay. This is an addenda to the poem by a woman named Moina Michael. Oh, you who sleep in Flanders field, sleep sweet to rise anew. We caught the torch you threw, and holding high we keep the faith with all who died. That's how poppies became a symbol of war. Okay, let's go on a year or two. Rudyard Kipling. He lost his son in the war, incidentally. If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. This is a poem in a soldier's hospital. Crippled for life at 17, his great eyes seemed to question why. With both legs smashed, it might have been better in that grim trench to die than drag maimed years out helplessly. By a poet named Wilfred Owen. Do any of you know his name?
Yes.
Wilfred Owen. He was a vastly talented, he was an enormously talented poet. And he led a unit on the Western Front that was gassed, because they began using poison gas. The Germans were the first to use it because it was invented by a German scientist, happened to be Jewish also. But it had terrible effects, as you can imagine. So he wrote this poem in 1918, after their gas attack. And I don't have enough, I don't think, but maybe you could just pass them back or around. Do you know what the phrase dulce et decorum est pro patria mori? It's Latin. It means, right, sweet and appropriate. Yeah. It is to die for your country. Well, this is his, I guess, one of his most famous poems. Incidentally, when the armistice bells were ringing and his parents were preparing to go to the celebration, they got a telegram informing them of his death. Okay. This is his poem. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gurgling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And as I say, his parents received news of his death when they were prepared to go out to the armistice celebration. 1919, William Butler Yeats, one of the great poets of the century. He was also, there was also in 1916 the beginning of an Irish revolt in Ireland against the British. There was always always a tension, and it had exploded in 1916, the so-called Easter Rising. So Yeats apparently was an advocate of the rebels in Ireland. Michael, what was his name? Collins, right, Michael Collins, right, the guerrilla leader and so on. This is Yeats. This is just a few stanzas from one of the most famous poems of the century, The Second Coming. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosened. And what rough beast, its hour come at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. In other words, he could almost foresee that out of this war, something terrible would come. That a total rejection of all the 19th century, 18th century norms, that something terrible was going to be born, that something was gone. All the basic tenets of Western civilization have been destroyed during this war. It's just a terrible. This was the setting for the peace conference. The Germans, Ludendorff, as I say, had orchestrated this great campaign, and they were winning until suddenly they weren't winning. The American troops, and he foresaw, he could see these fresh troops arriving, and so he went to the Kaiser and said, we can't. He was already planning a campaign in the Middle East. He was planning a campaign into Mesopotamia, already planning the Middle Eastern strategy. Now suddenly, how could this have happened? You understand the Germans' inability. What happened? We were betrayed. We were winning. We got tired of winning. And now suddenly, Ludendorff came to the Kaiser. It's over. Well, what did this lead to? It led to upheaval in German cities. It led to terrible, they couldn't believe it. That was at the peace conference. You're giving us these terms. What, did we lose the war? We just beat Russia. We are controlling most of European Russia. Now you tell us we're beaten? Oh, it can't be. How did it happen? Well, there were traitors at home who must have betrayed us. And who might those traitors be? Who might those traitors be? Plotting against us. They came to the Kaiser. We'll get better terms if you retire. You could go to Holland because you've got a cousin. The Queen's your cousin, and she'll make sure you're fine. Why should I retire? Because of a handful of Jews. His exact words. Well, that, of course. So that was, and all of this was for nothing. All of this suffering and death and all the rest of it, and we were winning, and then suddenly we're going, well, we know It was the United States had stepped on to the international stage for the first time. How could this be? A little while ago, they were chasing guerrillas in Mexico. Sancho Panza, remember Pershing was chasing them? How could all of a sudden they're a colossus bestriding? But the peace was welcome in most of the world. When Wilson went directly to Europe to participate, he brought with him his 14 points. This is the New World Order. And what he listed in the 14 points, crowned, of course, by an international organization that would settle all disputes. There would never be another war because they would take it to the League of Nations, and then that was the critical point in his war. The others, they would restore Belgium, Alsace-Lorraine would go back to France. They were practical matters. The freedom of the seas, no more embargoes and blockades. It was a list of eminently sensible points. But when he came to Europe, he was treated like the great Messiah. Thank God, Woodrow, people in Italy put up shrines and made offerings to his image. He was sent by God. All the poor people in the world, I have all these quotes on how they received Wilson, who was certainly, here are the 14 points: abolishment of secret diplomacy, removal of economic barriers, reduction of armaments, colonial claims to be adjusted, a welcome to the Russian government, a restoration of Belgium, a readjustment of frontiers, a restoration of the Balkans, and so on. But the League of Nations was key. And the League of Nations was actually first suggested, the founder in Philadelphia, June 1915. It was called the American League to Enforce Peace, by Taft and the U.S. ambassador to Belgium, a man named Marbury. And it suggested a world order. There had already been experience with the Hague Court and so on in 1900, but this was something new, and this was something that would avoid another war like this, because no one could survive. Civilization could not survive another war. When the Germans now sue for peace, Ludendorff said it's over, we can't go on. There was revolution breaking out inside of Germany, patterned on the Russian variety. They're worried about what's coming next, maybe a Bolshevik revolution. They now ask for peace. And who asks for peace? Well, the Kaiser has already gone off to Holland. He's got an estate. He'll live out there till 1942, as a matter of fact. Well, how are we going to? Well, there are several parties in the Reichstag, Democratic parties, Catholic Party, and so on. They weren't the ones who were responsible for the war. But let's send them to, let's have them authorize the generals going to asking for peace terms. The armistice, they would ask for the armistice. The people who made the war didn't go to ask for the armistice. It was the parties, the Democratic Party, the Catholic Party, the Socialist Party. They were left there. Well, we'll have to make the peace. You're not the ones who made the decisions, but nevertheless, you're the elected Reichstag. You have to go ask for it. So they asked the French if they could meet and discuss an armistice. And you know they met in the famous railroad car at Compiègne. They asked for a peace on the basis of the 14 points. And the French agreed. There was a basic miscommunication here. This has been a terrible war. What's this 14 points business? That's folderol that Wilson invented. He's a minister's son. He's a child of the manse, they called him. They came in 1917. Our casualties, 140,000. Nothing like the Europeans. And so we have to make our own arrangements. It's interesting that before Wilson arrived, Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, and Lloyd George, the British, got together in England. And it's a famous meeting. It's only recorded in a couple of places. And they had a conversation, something like, well, what would you like? And Clemenceau said, well, we're thinking about Syria and Lebanon, because the Sultan had collapsed. Oh, that sounds fine. We would like Basra and Mosul. Familiar names now, but not then. Mosul, isn't that where they have all the oil? Yes. Oh, well, said Clemenceau. He was a doctor. When I want oil, I go to the grocery store. The British had already converted the Navy from coal to oil during the war. That was Winston Churchill's doing. And so, there's a book by Margaret Macmillan called I Wish I'd Been There. And she describes a lot of these meetings that have only been rarely recorded. Oh, okay, that's Sykes-Picot Agreement still in force, right? War is over, this is how we'll divide the Middle East, sounds good to me. And let's not let that sanctimonious son of the manse, Woodrow Wilson, put his big nose into our affairs. We'll keep him busy at Versailles, but we won't let him really take an important role. He was busy most of the time negotiating the League of Nations, but nevertheless, they were making the deals behind the scenes. The Germans surrendered. We surrendered on the basis of the 14 points. Freedom of the seas, nationalities recognized, no one has to live in a country where his own nationality isn't in charge, and so on and so forth. I have the whole list. But basically, the armistice, they said, was on the basis of the 14 points. Well, they had lost the war. Were they in a position to make demands? No way. As the French, as Clement said, we didn't invade Germany. They came here. What about the damage to France? It will take millions and millions to repair this damage. Who pays? The loser pays. That's who pays. Germany invaded France in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. German troops remained in France until the French paid the indemnity. In proportion, it was more than the Treaty of Versailles specified for the German. But nevertheless, it's interesting. Just let me sum up in a way. Nothing could repair the damage of this war. And none of the issues were really settled because the Germans never admitted that they lost the war. How could this be if we were winning till the last minute? And even the democratic president of Germany, not a left-winger by any chance, he said, or a right-winger, he said when they gave him the terms of the treaty in June, I guess, of we're going to approach the 100th anniversary of the signing of we have a lot of 100th anniversaries coming. When they gave him the treaty, he sat down, he couldn't believe it. What? Did we lose the war? Well, yes, you did. And of course the treaty has a stigma about it because it really didn't last. It was Act 1, and 20 years later you had Act 2 again. But basically, and the United States never signed the treaty. So we absented ourselves. Wilson was ill. He had had a series of strokes even before he went to Europe. He was lionized when he came to Europe. He met the Queen, and the King and the Queen, they didn't care for his personality, I understand. But nevertheless, he was a towering figure. People named their children after him. They had statues of him. They prayed to him. It was an extraordinary reception, but as Clemenceau put it, God gave us 10 commandments and we broke every one. Wilson has given us 14 points. We shall see. I think I have to stop now. Thanks a lot.